Xiaomi launched both the Xiaomi 11T and also the Xiaomi 11T Pro in the most recent event. And personally, I was looking forward to these two phones in particular since the last generation's Mi 10T Pro was one of my favorite of all times for the year of 2020. So in today's video, I'm gonna do both of these phones review and comparison together. So let's begin. So this video is gonna be a bit longer than usual because we have to go through these two phones together in the same video, but we'll still break it down to our usual 6 points of a smartphone, and we'll start off with the design. So both the Xiaomi 11T and the Xiaomi 11T Pro are, well, as you can see on the table here, they both look 100% identical. And since we have both of these phones in the new meteorite grey color, I honestly have a hard time trying to differentiate which phone is which. Yeah, I think you can pretty much guess how many times I took the wrong phone off my table. That aside, I don't know what sort of material Xiaomi is using for the backs of these two phones because I've checked the Mi 11T and the Mi 11T Pro's website. There's no mention of what kind of material this is using, and also the spec sheets, they just neglected to tell us what material this is. And from what I can feel here, it's well, I wouldn't say it's glass, but if it is glass, then this is a pretty horrendous piece of glass because yeah, you can pretty much hear that this is not really good. And I personally would have preferred a stronger piece of plastic like the Galaxy S20 FE rather than a cheap piece of glass. But that doesn't really matter since most of us is gonna slap a case on this phone anyway, and so the color and also this back material doesn't really matter at the end of the day. Now let's move on to the specs, because this year is a bit more interesting because Xiaomi decided to shake things up by using two different chipsets on these two phones. So the Xiaomi 11T is powered by the MediaTek Dimensity 1200 chipset, whereby the Xiaomi 11T Pro is using the usual Qualcomm Snapdragon 888 chipset. And as for every other specs of these phones, they are pretty much identical overall. And I think this is the perfect scenario to show you how bad the Snapdragon 888 is, because this chipset is a furnace. Earlier this year when we reviewed the Mi 11, that was the first phone from Xiaomi to use the new Snapdragon 888 chipset, and it overheated so badly that it even introduced a brand new issue which is called DC dimming, because the AMOLED screen will have to cut down its brightness just to prevent overheating. But this thermal issue is no longer present with the Xiaomi 11T Pro because Xiaomi, well, they did not fix this issue, but they skirted it around by introducing a very hard thermal limit of about 46 degrees Celsius. So that means the Xiaomi 11T Pro Snapdragon 888 chipset will perform really bad, but it doesn't overheat. So in some ways, it kind of shows how inefficient the Snapdragon 888 is, because this thermal limit can be reached very easily and very quickly. And this is also very apparent in our gaming test video, where the Xiaomi 11T Pro can dip down to about 20-ish FPS, and that is horrible. But for the 11T, the non-Pro version, powered by the MediaTek Dimensity 1200 chipset, is much more powerful and smoother, yet consistent throughout our gaming test. We were getting about 40-ish FPS at the same game setting and with the same thermal limit of 46 degrees Celsius too. Seriously, I am impressed by what MediaTek has created for this generation of flagship chipsets. Now let's move on to the cameras then. The Xiaomi 11T and the 11T Pro uses the exact same cameras between these two phones. So we have a total of 3 cameras on both of these phones, but I generally think it's a downgrade overall. The 11T and the 11T Pro does take some good looking pictures overall, but even with the same hardware, they both created different looks in the pictures that they took. Sometimes the 11T looks better, but sometimes the 11T Pro looks better instead. I can't decide which is better, honestly, and from what I can see here, the Xiaomi 11T does have a less saturated look overall, which might not be appealing to some people, but the 11T's picture is also not as over sharpened as the 11T Pro. As for the ultra-wide angle camera, it also got a downgrade from its previous generation, as it is now an 8 megapixel sensor, and the lens also shrunk in terms of field of view to only 120 degrees, And one more thing that I did realize is the 11T Pro has a very bad shutter response lag. It takes about a good second or two for the picture to actually be taken, but this shutter response lag is not present on the 11T. So I think it kind of goes to show that Xiaomi isn't doing that much optimization. And this kind of issue is really dependent on Xiaomi because we have to wait for them to push out an update to potentially fix this issue. But that's not all. I also think that the 11T Pro got the biggest downgrade here because it doesn't have OIS anymore if you compare with last generation's Mi 10T Pro. So what we have now on both of these phones is the very aggressive gyro-based EIS system instead. So we compared the stabilization between the Mi 10T Pro and the new 11T Pro, and I have to say the Mi 10T Pro's OIS isn't exactly the best out there, but there is no weird warping if we compare it with EIS. Because if you use EIS plus a very aggressive system, it will be stabilized very well, but it does feel nauseous because you can see there are a lot of warping happening in this shot here. Like the trees, for example, they just zoom in and out for no apparent reason, and it's just not comfortable to watch. And since the 11T Pro doesn't have OIS anymore, taking night shots that require long exposure is gonna be an issue compared to the Mi 10T Pro from last year. As you can see here, it's just a bit more fuzzy and also potentially over sharpened because the software needs to compensate for your hand shakiness. So you will require a tripod if you want to take some decent looking night shots with these two phones here because they don't have OIS. The macro camera though, both of these phones got a big upgrade because they are now using a tele-macro lens. So it is essentially a zoomed in macro camera compared to last time. So when you want to take a macro shot, the phone's shadow will not be in the shot, and that is actually a huge improvement even though it doesn't sound like much. And now let's talk about the screens of these two phones then. I would say they got a big upgrade actually. So both of these phones are still using the same 6.67 inch size, but they have been upgraded to AMOLED displays and they are now going up to 120Hz refresh rate with adaptive sync as well. So it can reduce some refresh rate if you are not using it to save some battery life. And honestly, the screen just looks good. I don't really have anything to complain about. And the 11T Pro also has Dolby Vision, so if you compare both of these screens side by side by playing the same video, they do look different. Now, one of the main selling points of these two phones here is of course the charging speeds. So we'll start off first with the 11T because it comes with a 5000 mAh battery and it can last for a pretty long time in our battery life test as well, so no problems if you want to use it throughout one whole day straight. And the charger that comes in the box for this 11T is a 67 watt charger. It can charge from 15 to 100% in about 40-ish minutes, and I would say it's pretty standard because this is not the first time that we are testing a 67 watt charger anyway. But this 67 watt charger is a proprietary charger, so you cannot charge any other things at these speeds. And we also tried to charge this 11T with our 100 watts Ugreen charger, and unfortunately it only takes in 18 watts. But for the 11T Pro, this is where things get interesting because this phone also comes with a 5000 mAh battery and the battery life lasts for a very long time. But what's interesting here is of course the 120 watts charger. Xiaomi fixes a lot of issue with this generation of fast charger because they first gave it a name. It's now called the 120 watts Xiaomi Hypercharge or something like that. And this is still a proprietary charger because you will need this charger and also this phone to receive the full 120 watts of power. But this charger can output USB PD 3.0 standards as well because I tested it with one of our laptops and it charges at 65 watts, so that's good. And this phone, if we plug it into the Ugreen 100 watts charger, it also takes in 65 watts. So I would say Xiaomi is finally improving in terms of its charging standards because not only that they did not throw away the charger in the box, but by adopting USB PD standards and then further developing on top of USB PD standards, I would say it's much more eco-friendly compared to many other proprietary fast charging standards. I'm looking at you, Oppo, Vivo, all the VOOC and whatnot. And then we should move on to the software side of things, because these two phones is still using MIUI, and it's actually running MIUI 12.5, but the build is slightly different overall. And it's still the same MIUI as before, and you can check out some of our previous reviews of some other Xiaomi phones where we talk more about the MIUI, so check it out at the top right corner there. One thing that they partially fixed, I would say, is the screen recorder issue, because I pointed this out in the Mi 11 Ultra review where it can only go up to 30 FPS for screen recording. And now it's even funkier because the Xiaomi 11T can only go up to 30 FPS, but for some reason, the 11T Pro can go up to 90 FPS for screen recording. I don't know what kind of overcompensation they're trying to do, but there you go. And Xiaomi also vowed for 3 generations of system updates for these two phones with 4 years of security patches. As for how quickly and often these updates will be shipped out, that is something that I cannot answer. And some other things that we have to mention here is that these two phones don't have HDMI output over Type-C, there's no IP rating, and there's also no wireless charging on these two phones. And now finally, for the price for these two phones. The Xiaomi 11T is actually a pretty good phone overall. Compared to last year's Mi 10T, I would say there are a few upgrades here and there. So the price of 1,699 for 11T is actually justifiable. So if you wanna change to this phone, go on ahead. The MediaTek Dimensity 1200 is also very powerful, so yeah, I can see why it's appealing to many people. But for the 11T Pro on the other hand, this is a phone that I cannot recommend because the performance out of the Snapdragon AAA chipset is severely limited. The cameras have been downgraded too, particularly due to the lack of OIS on the Xiaomi 11T Pro when you compare it with last year's Mi 10T Pro. And for the price of 2,099 ringgit, yeah, not really that good. It's better if you want to wait for some other smartphones that is coming in the future. Maybe wait for the new Snapdragon 898 or whatever the hell they want to name it, because the 888 is just not a good chip overall. So yeah, that's it. That's all we have to share with you about these two phones review and comparison. So if you have any questions, leave them down in the comment section below, and we'll see you guys in the next video.